The morning sun barely touched the horizon when Maria Santos pulled her old pickup truck into the ambulance station parking lot. She was 23 years old, with calloused hands and tired eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. The small mountain town of San Miguel had only 2 ambulances, and Maria drove one of them 6 days a week. Nobody expected much from the quiet girl who had grown up in the poorest part of town. Her father had died when she was 12, leaving her mother to raise 4 children on her own. Maria dropped out of school at 16 to work, but she kept studying at night by candlelight. She earned her emergency medical technician certificate through a program at the local clinic. The other paramedics often joked that Maria was too small to do the job properly. She stood only 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighed barely 110 pounds. When they had to lift heavy patients, the men would shake their heads and mutter that women weren't built for this kind of work. Maria never argued back. She just did her job quietly and went home to her mother's house each night. Dr. Rodriguez, who ran the medical clinic, was different from the others. He had watched Maria work for 2 years and noticed things the other men missed. She was gentle with frightened patients, but firm when they needed tough love. She could star in 4-line in a moving ambulance on a bumpy mountain road better than paramedics with 10 years of experience. Most importantly, she never panicked, no matter how bad the emergency. The town of San Miguel sat in a valley, surrounded by steep mountains covered in thick forest. Only one main road connected it to the outside world, winding through dangerous curves and narrow bridges. The nearest hospital was 60 miles away, which meant Maria and her partner often had to keep patients alive for over an hour during transport. On this particular Tuesday morning, Maria checked her equipment like she did every day. She counted bandages, tested the oxygen tank, and made sure the radio worked properly. Her partner, Carlos, showed up 20 minutes late with coffee breath and bloodshot eyes. He had been drinking the night before, but Maria said nothing. Carlos was the son of the mayor, and everyone knew he couldn't be fired no matter how poorly he performed. Their first call came at 9:15. An elderly man had fallen from his roof while trying to fix loose tiles. When they arrived at the small adobe house, they found him conscious but in severe pain. His leg was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. His wife was crying and speaking rapidly in the local dialect, explaining that he had been trying to repair damage from the recent storms. Maria knelt beside the injured man and spoke to him in a calm, gentle voice. She carefully examined his leg while Carlos stood nearby, looking uncomfortable. The break was serious, and the man was going into shock from the pain. Maria quickly started in 4-line and gave him pain medication while explaining each step to keep him calm. As they loaded the patient into the ambulance, Maria noticed something that made her stomach tighten with worry. 3 men in military uniforms were standing across the street, watching them work. They weren't local police or army personnel. Their uniforms were different, darker, and they carried automatic weapons. When one of them pointed at the ambulance and spoke to the others, Maria felt a chill run down her spine. The 60-mile drive to the hospital usually took about 70 minutes on the winding mountain roads. Maria drove carefully but quickly, checking on their patient regularly through the rearview mirror. Carlos was supposed to monitor the man's vital signs, but he spent most of the trip staring out the window or complaining about the bumpy ride. Halfway to the hospital, they passed a military checkpoint that hadn't been there the week before. Soldiers stopped their ambulance and demanded to see their identification papers. The commanding officer was a young man with cold eyes who seemed more interested in looking inside the ambulance than checking their credentials. "What is your destination?" he asked Maria in Spanish that wasn't local. "Regional hospital, sir," she replied politely. "We have an emergency patient." The officer walked around the ambulance slowly, noting the license plate number and examining the medical equipment. He asked several questions about their route and how often they made trips to the hospital. Maria answered truthfully but felt increasingly nervous. Finally, he waved them through, but not before warning them that new security measures were being implemented throughout the region. At the hospital, Maria helped transfer their patient to the emergency room staff. While Carlos went to the cafeteria, she spoke quietly with Dr. Herrera, an old friend who worked at the hospital. She described the soldier she had seen and asked if he knew what was happening. Dr. Herrera's expression grew serious. He pulled her aside and spoke in a low voice. "There have been rumors for weeks," he said. "Some kind of conflict is building in the mountains. Different groups are fighting for control of the region. The government sent troops, but nobody knows whose side they're really on." Maria felt her heart sink. She had heard whispers about armed groups operating in the remote areas, but she had hoped it was just gossip. Now it seemed the conflict was spreading closer to home. On the drive back to San Miguel, Maria noticed more signs of military activity. Helicopters flew overhead in formation, and smoke was rising from somewhere deep in the mountains. When they reached the checkpoint again, different soldiers were on duty. These men seemed more nervous than the morning shift, constantly scanning the tree line and speaking into their radios. Back in town, Maria dropped Carlos off at the station and drove home to her mother's small house. Her younger brothers were playing soccer in the dusty street, and her sister Carmen was hanging laundry behind the house. Everything looked normal, but Maria couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful world was about to change forever. That evening, as she sat on the front step watching the sun set behind the mountains, her neighbor, Don Fernando, approached. He was an old man who had lived through many troubles and had a reputation for knowing things before others did. "Maria," he said quietly, settling beside her on the step, "you should be careful with your ambulance work. These are dangerous times coming." "What do you mean, Don Fernando?" The old man was quiet for a long moment, looking up at the darkening mountains. "There are groups up there who don't trust anyone in uniform, not even medical personnel. And there are other groups who might try to use ambulances for things they weren't meant for." He paused and looked directly at her. "A smart young woman like you should keep her eyes open and be ready for anything." After he left, Maria sat alone thinking about his words. She had become an ambulance driver to help people and save lives. The idea that her work might somehow become dangerous had never occurred to her. She thought about the soldiers at the checkpoint, the helicopters, and the smoke in the mountains. Inside the house, she could hear her mother preparing dinner and her siblings doing homework. This was her world, simple, peaceful, and safe. She was determined to protect it, though she had no idea yet what that might require. As she finally went inside for dinner, Maria made a mental note to pay closer attention to everything happening around her. If trouble was really coming to San Miguel, she wanted to be prepared. She had no way of knowing that within a few weeks, her life would change completely, and the quiet ambulance driver would discover strength and courage she never knew she possessed. The next morning brought news that would begin her transformation from a medical worker into something much more complicated and dangerous. The emergency call came at 4 in the morning, jarring Maria from deep sleep. Her radio crackled with static and urgency. A logging truck had overturned on the mountain road about 15 miles outside town. Multiple injuries were reported, and both ambulances were needed immediately. Maria dressed quickly in the dark, trying not to wake her family. As she drove through the empty streets toward the station, she noticed something odd. Several houses that should have been dark at this hour had lights on, and she saw people loading belongings into vehicles. A sense of unease settled in her stomach. At the station, Carlos was already there, along with the crew from the second ambulance. Everyone looked tense. The dispatcher, an older woman named Rosa, handed them the details with shaking hands. "The truck went off the road near kilometer marker 23, she explained. The driver called it in on his radio before the signal cut out. He said there were at least 4 men injured, maybe more. The drive to the accident site took them deeper into the mountains than Maria usually traveled. The road became narrower and more dangerous with each mile. As they climbed higher, the radio signals from town became weaker and filled with static. They were entering an area where communication with the outside world was nearly impossible. When they rounded a sharp curve near the reported location, Maria saw something that made her slam on the brakes. The logging truck was there, overturned in the ditch exactly as reported. But surrounding it were more than a dozen men in mismatched military clothing, all carrying weapons. This wasn't a simple accident scene. Carlos cursed under his breath and reached for the radio, but Maria grabbed his wrist. "Wait," she whispered. "Let's see what they want first." A tall man with a beard approached their ambulance. He was older than the others, maybe 40, with intelligent eyes and a calm manner. He spoke to them in Spanish, but his accent was different from the local dialect. "Are you the medical team?" he asked politely. "Yes," Maria replied. "We received a call about injured men." The bearded man nodded. "We do have injured men, but this situation is more complicated than what was reported. My name is Commander Vasquez. These men are part of a resistance group fighting against the corrupt government forces that have been terrorizing this region." Maria's heart began beating faster. She had heard rumors about resistance groups, but she had never expected to encounter them directly. "We're here to provide medical care," she said carefully. "We don't get involved in politics." Commander Vasquez smiled grimly. "Unfortunately, in times like these, medical care becomes political whether you want it to or not." He gestured toward the overturned truck. "We were transporting supplies when government forces ambushed us. 3 of my men were injured in the attack. We need your help." Maria looked at Carlos, who was pale with fear. Behind them, the second ambulance had arrived, and she could see the other crew waiting for direction. She made a quick decision that would change everything. "Show me the injured men," she said. Commander Vasquez led them to the truck. 3 men lay on makeshift stretchers beside the road. One had a bullet wound in his shoulder, another had a severe leg injury from the crash, and the third was unconscious with what appeared to be a head injury. All 3 needed immediate medical attention. As Maria began working on the wounded men, she noticed the other resistance fighters watching her carefully. They were young, most barely out of their teens, but they carried themselves with the seriousness of seasoned soldiers. Their weapons were a mixture of old hunting rifles and newer assault rifles that looked military issue. While Maria treated the bullet wound, Commander Vasquez explained the situation. The government had sent what they called special forces into the region, but these troops were actually working with drug cartels and criminal organizations. They were forcing local people to pay protection money and recruiting young men into their ranks through threats and violence. "Many of us are local people who decided to fight back," he explained. "We have teachers, farmers, small business owners. We're not criminals or terrorists. We're trying to protect our families and our communities." Maria listened while she worked, focusing on stopping the bleeding and stabilizing the wounded men. The bullet wound was clean, passing through muscle without hitting major organs. The leg injury required careful splinting to prevent further damage during transport. The head injury was more serious, and the man needed to reach a hospital quickly. "We can take them to the regional hospital," Maria offered. "But you should know there are military checkpoints on the main road." Commander Vasquez shook his head. "Government forces control that hospital now. They arrest anyone suspected of supporting the resistance. We have a different destination in mind." He gave her directions to a location about 30 miles in the opposite direction. It was a small clinic run by a doctor who sympathized with the resistance movement. The route would take them through back roads that avoided government checkpoints, but it would be more dangerous due to the rough terrain. Maria made another quick decision. "We'll take them," she said, "but I need to send the other ambulance back to town. If both crews disappear, people will start asking questions." Commander Vasquez agreed. The second ambulance crew was told to return to San Miguel and report that the first ambulance was still working on serious injuries that required extended transport time. This would buy them several hours before anyone became suspicious. As they loaded the wounded men into Maria's ambulance, one of the young fighters approached her. He looked familiar, and after a moment, she recognized him as Miguel, a boy who had been in her sister's class at school. He had disappeared from town about 6 months ago, and his family had assumed he was dead. "Miguel," she said quietly, "your mother has been worried sick about you." The young man looked ashamed. "I couldn't stay, Maria. They came to our house and demanded that I join their group or they would hurt my family. I ran away instead and found the resistance." Maria felt a surge of anger at the forces that were tearing families apart. This wasn't some distant political conflict. It was destroying the lives of people she had known since childhood. The journey to the hidden clinic took nearly 3 hours over rough mountain roads. Maria drove carefully to avoid worsening the injuries of her patients, while Carlos monitored their vital signs. Despite his fear, Carlos proved surprisingly helpful during the transport, following Maria's instructions and keeping the wounded men stable. The clinic was hidden in a valley so remote that Maria would never have found it without detailed directions. Dr. Elena Morales, a woman about Maria's age, had established the medical facility to serve resistance fighters and civilians who couldn't safely reach government-controlled hospitals. Dr. Morales was grateful for their help and impressed with Maria's medical skills. As they transferred the patients, she explained that trained medical personnel were desperately needed in the resistance movement. Too many fighters were dying from treatable injuries simply because they lacked proper medical care. "We're not asking you to become soldiers," she told Maria, "but we could use medical professionals who understand our situation and are willing to help when needed." Maria promised to consider it, but she was already beginning to understand that neutrality might not be possible in this conflict. On the long drive back to San Miguel, she and Carlos didn't speak much, both lost in their own thoughts about what they had experienced. When they finally reached town late that evening, everything looked different to Maria. The peaceful streets seemed fragile, as if they could be shattered at any moment. She noticed things she had missed before: certain houses that were now empty, young men who had recently disappeared, families who seemed afraid to go out after dark. At the station, they filed a routine report about a difficult transport to the regional hospital. Rosa accepted the story without question, but Maria could see worry in the older woman's eyes. Everyone in town was beginning to sense that trouble was approaching, even if they didn't understand exactly what it was. That night, Maria lay awake thinking about everything that had happened. She had become involved in something much larger and more dangerous than emergency medical work. The comfortable life she had known was disappearing, and she would soon have to make choices she had never imagined facing. 3 days later, the government forces came to San Miguel in force. What happened next would push Maria further down a path that would transform the quiet ambulance driver into someone completely different, someone willing to pick up a weapon and fight for what she believed in. The war had found her peaceful mountain town, and nothing would ever be the same. The sound of helicopters woke the entire town before dawn. Maria pulled back her bedroom curtain and saw 3 military aircraft circling overhead like hunting vultures. Their searchlights swept across the streets, and the thunderous noise of their rotors seemed to shake the very foundations of her mother's small house. By the time Maria got dressed and stepped outside, soldiers were already moving through the streets in organized squads. They wore the same dark uniform she had seen at the checkpoint, but now there were dozens of them, all heavily armed and moving with purpose. This wasn't a routine patrol. This was an invasion. Her neighbor Don Fernando appeared at his front door, his face grim. "They're searching every house," he told her quietly, "looking for weapons and resistance supporters. They've already arrested the Gutierrez family from the corner house." Maria's blood ran cold. The Gutierrez family consisted of an elderly couple and their teenage granddaughter. What possible threat could they pose? She watched as soldiers forced people out of their homes at gunpoint, making them stand in the street while their houses were ransacked. "I have to get to the station," Maria said. "People are going to need medical help." Don Fernando grabbed her arm. "Be very careful, child. These soldiers aren't here to protect anyone. They're here to control and intimidate." Maria walked quickly through the chaotic streets toward the ambulance station. She passed soldiers breaking down doors and overturning furniture in their searches. Some homes were being marked with spray paint, a red X on those they had searched, and a black X on those where they had found something suspicious. At the station, she found Rosa in tears. "They took Carlos," the dispatcher sobbed. "Arrested him right in front of me. Said he was suspected of aiding rebels." Maria felt sick. Carlos might have been lazy and unreliable, but he was no rebel. His only crime was being in the wrong place when the soldiers needed to arrest someone to make their operation look successful. "What about the ambulances?" Maria asked. "They're confiscating both vehicles," Rosa replied. "Say they need to inspect them for contraband. We're ordered to cease all operations until further notice." Maria stared at the empty ambulance bay where her vehicle should have been. For 2 years, that ambulance had been her life. She had saved dozens of people with it, rushing them to safety when illness or accident threatened their lives. Now it was gone, taken by soldiers who saw medical equipment as potential weapons. The reality of the situation began to sink in. Without ambulances, what would happen when people had medical emergencies? The nearest hospital was 60 miles away, and now there was no way to transport critical patients. People would die not from their injuries or illnesses, but from the government's paranoia about resistance activities. A commotion in the street drew her attention. Through the station window, she saw soldiers dragging a young man from a nearby house. It was Pedro, the son of the baker, barely 18 years old. They were accusing him of having weapons, but Maria had known Pedro since he was a child. He was quiet and gentle, more interested in reading books than fighting anyone. Without thinking, Maria stepped outside. "Excuse me," she called to the commanding officer. "That young man isn't involved in anything illegal. He works in his family's bakery." The officer turned to look at her with cold, calculating eyes. He was the same man who had questioned her at the checkpoint days earlier. "And you are?" "Maria Santos. I'm a paramedic with the local ambulance service." "Ah, yes," he said with a thin smile. "We've been wanting to speak with you. You've been making some interesting trips lately." Maria's heart began racing, but she kept her voice steady. "I transport patients to the hospital. That's my job, including trips to locations that aren't on any hospital routes," the officer continued. "We have reports of your ambulance being seen in areas known to harbor resistance fighters." The accusation was vague, but threatening. Maria realized that someone must have reported seeing her ambulance during the trip to the hidden clinic. In a small community, it was impossible to move around without someone noticing. "I go wherever there are injured people who need help," she replied carefully. "Medical emergencies don't always happen in convenient locations." The officer studied her for a long moment, then motioned to 2 of his soldiers. "Bring her along," he ordered. "We'll question her properly at headquarters." As the soldiers moved toward her, Maria felt a surge of panic. She had heard stories about people who were taken for questioning and never returned. The government forces were using intimidation and disappearances to control the population. "Wait," called a familiar voice. Dr. Rodriguez was approaching from the direction of his clinic, his medical bag in hand. "Captain, this woman is essential medical personnel. We have injured civilians who need immediate treatment." The officer looked annoyed by the interruption. "Doctor, we're conducting a security operation. Medical concerns are secondary." "With respect, Captain, medical emergencies don't wait for security operations to finish," Dr. Rodriguez replied firmly. "I have 3 patients with serious injuries from your house searches, including a pregnant woman who may be having complications. I need my best paramedic to help save lives." Maria felt grateful for the doctor's intervention, but she could see that the officer wasn't convinced. He seemed to be weighing his options, considering whether arresting her would cause more problems than it solved. The decision was made for him when gunfire erupted from the mountains surrounding the town. The sharp crack of rifles echoed across the valley, followed by the heavier sound of automatic weapons. The resistance had arrived. Immediately, the soldiers forgot about Maria and focused on the new threat. Orders were shouted in military jargon as they took defensive positions. The officer who had been questioning her grabbed his radio and began calling for reinforcements. Dr. Rodriguez seized the moment. "Come quickly," he told Maria. "We have work to do." They hurried toward his clinic as the gunfire intensified. Behind them, Maria could hear helicopters taking off, presumably to engage the resistance fighters who were attacking from the forest. The peaceful morning had become a war zone in a matter of minutes. At the clinic, Maria found the 3 injured patients Dr. Rodriguez had mentioned. The pregnant woman was indeed having complications, possibly brought on by the stress of having soldiers ransack her home. An elderly man had been struck by rifle, but when he protested their treatment of his wife. A teenage boy had been beaten for refusing to reveal the location of his older brother, who had disappeared weeks earlier. As Maria worked to treat these injuries, she felt her anger growing. These weren't combatants or criminals. They were innocent people whose only crime was living in a place where others had chosen to fight. The government forces claimed to be protecting the population, but they were causing as much harm as any enemy. The battle in the mountains continued for hours. From the clinic windows, Maria could see muzzle flashes among the trees and smoke rising from several locations. Helicopters circled like angry wasps, firing rockets at targets she couldn't see. The sound was constant and terrifying. Around midday, the first wounded soldiers began arriving at the clinic. Dr. Rodriguez had no choice but to treat them, even though they represented the force that was terrorizing his community. As Maria helped care for a young soldier with a leg wound, she couldn't help but notice that he looked no older than her youngest brother. "Why are you fighting here?" she asked him quietly as she bandaged his injury. The soldier looked confused by the question. "Orders," he replied. "They told us this area was full of terrorists who wanted to destroy the government." "Do we look like terrorists to you?" Maria asked, gesturing around the clinic at the civilian patients. The young soldier didn't answer, but she could see doubt in his eyes. He was beginning to understand that the situation was more complicated than his commanders had told him. As the afternoon wore on, more wounded people arrived at the clinic. Some were government soldiers, others were civilians caught in the crossfire, and a few were resistance fighters who risked their lives to seek medical help. Dr. Rodriguez treated them all without discrimination, but Maria could see the strain wearing on him. Late in the day, Commander Vasquez appeared at the clinic's back door. His clothes were torn and bloody, and he moved with the careful steps of someone trying not to worsen an injury. "Doctor," he said quietly, "we need help." Dr. Rodriguez looked around nervously. Treating resistance fighters in the middle of a government operation was extremely dangerous, but his medical oath prevented him from turning away injured people. "How many?" he asked. "7 wounded, 3 serious," Commander Vasquez replied. "We can't reach our usual medical facility. Government forces have it surrounded." Maria made a decision that surprised even her. "Bring them in through the back," she told the commander. "We'll treat them." Dr. Rodriguez stared at her. "Maria, if we're caught." "Then we're caught," she replied. "I became a paramedic to save lives, not to choose which lives are worth saving based on politics." Over the next several hours, Maria found herself treating resistance fighters alongside government soldiers and civilian casualties. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on her. In the same room, she was working to heal people who had been trying to kill each other just hours earlier. One of the resistance fighters was Miguel, the young man she had recognized days earlier. He had been shot in the arm and was in considerable pain. As she cleaned and dressed his wound, he told her what was really happening in the conflict. "They're not trying to fight terrorism," he explained. "They're trying to control the drug routes through these mountains. The resistance is getting in the way of their business deals with the cartels." This explanation made sense of many things Maria had observed but not understood. The government forces weren't behaving like legitimate military units. They were acting more like organized criminals with official backing. As night fell, the fighting gradually subsided. The government forces had control of the town, but the resistance had proven they could strike when and where they chose. It was clear that this conflict was far from over. When the last patient had been treated and the clinic finally grew quiet, Maria sat outside in the dark garden behind the building. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The day had shown her a side of the world she had never seen before, a world where innocent people suffered while powerful groups fought over money and control. Dr. Rodriguez joined her in the garden. "You did good work today," he said quietly. "Did I?" Maria replied. "I feel like I helped everyone and saved no one." "Sometimes that's all we can do," the doctor answered. "Keep treating the wounded and hope that eventually the fighting stops." But Maria was beginning to think that hope wasn't enough. The government forces had shown they were willing to terrorize civilians to achieve their goals. The resistance was growing stronger and more desperate. Unless something changed, the violence would only get worse. As she walked home through the darkened streets, past houses marked with paint and debris from the day's searches, Maria realized that her life as a simple ambulance driver was over. The conflict had found her community and forced her to make choices she had never wanted to face. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and harder decisions. Soon, she would have to choose not just whom to heal, but whom to fight for. The quiet young woman who had only wanted to help people was about to discover that sometimes helping people meant picking up a weapon and standing against those who would harm them. 2 weeks after the government occupation of San Miguel began, Maria's world collapsed completely. She was returning home from another long day at Dr. Rodriguez's clinic when she saw the smoke rising from her neighborhood. Her heart began racing as she ran through the streets, pushing past other residents who were fleeing in the opposite direction. The sight that greeted her would haunt her for the rest of her life. Her family's small house was nothing but charred ruins and smoking debris. Neighbors stood in shocked silence, some crying, others staring in disbelief at the destruction. "Where's my family?" Maria screamed, grabbing the arm of Mrs. Lopez, who lived next door. The elderly woman's eyes were filled with tears. "They took them away," she sobbed. "The soldiers came this morning, saying they had found resistance propaganda in your house. Your mother tried to explain that you work as a paramedic, but they wouldn't listen." Maria felt the world spinning around her. "Took them where?" "To the detention center they set up at the old factory," Mrs. Lopez replied. "But, Maria, you can't go there. They're looking for you too. Someone told them you've been helping the resistance fighters." The accusation hit Maria like a physical blow. Yes, she had treated wounded resistance members, but she had also treated government soldiers and civilians. She had tried to remain neutral, to help anyone who needed medical care regardless of their politics. Apparently, neutrality was no longer an option. Don Fernando appeared at her side, his weathered face grave with concern. "Child, you must listen to me carefully," he said in a low voice. "The soldiers have orders to arrest you on sight. You cannot stay in town." "I have to find my family," Maria protested. "And you will," Don Fernando replied. "But not by getting yourself arrested or killed. There are other ways to help them, but you must be smart about it." Maria looked around at the ruins of her life. Everything she had worked for, everything she cared about, was either destroyed or in the hands of people who saw her as an enemy. The peaceful existence she had tried so hard to preserve was gone forever. "What do you mean, other ways?" she asked. Don Fernando glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Commander Vasquez and his people are planning something. They need someone with your medical skills, but they also need people who know this town and understand how the government forces operate." The old man was suggesting that she join the resistance actively, not just as a medical volunteer, but as a full member of their fighting force. The idea terrified and angered her at the same time. She had never wanted to be a soldier, but the government had made that choice for her by destroying her family and her home. "Where are they?" she asked quietly. "There's a cave system about 5 miles up the mountain trail behind the old quarry," Don Fernando explained. "Miguel knows the way. He's been waiting for you." Maria looked back at the smoking ruins one more time, then made a decision that would change everything. "Tell me how to find him." That night, using paths she had known since childhood, Maria made her way up the mountain to the resistance camp. The cave system was larger than she had expected, with multiple chambers connected by narrow tunnels. Oil lamps provided dim lighting, and The smell of wood smoke mixed with dampness created an atmosphere that was both primitive and secretive. Commander Vasquez greeted her with a mixture of sympathy and urgency. "I'm sorry about your family," he said, "but we're going to get them back. The government has made a serious mistake by taking civilian hostages." "What's your plan?" Maria asked. The commander spread a hand-drawn map on a wooden table. "The detention center is heavily guarded, but it has weaknesses. We know the building well because some of our people used to work in that factory. The problem is that any direct assault would put the prisoners in danger." Maria studied the map, recognizing the layout of the old textile factory that had closed years earlier. "What about the medical needs of the prisoners?" she asked. "They must have injuries and health problems." "That's exactly what we've been thinking," Commander Vasquez replied with approval. "The government forces have been requesting a medical professional to examine the prisoners. They want to avoid accusations of torture or neglect." The plan that emerged was both simple and dangerous. Maria would volunteer to serve as the medical examiner for the detention center, using her genuine credentials and reputation in the community. Once inside, she would assess the condition of the prisoners and gather intelligence about the security arrangements. Then, the resistance would use that information to plan a rescue operation. "But there's something else," Commander Vasquez said seriously. "This won't just be a medical mission. You'll need to be prepared to fight when the rescue happens. Are you willing to do that?" Maria thought about her mother, her brothers, and her sister Carmen. She thought about all the innocent people who had been arrested simply for living in the wrong place at the wrong time. The gentle paramedic who had dedicated her life to healing was about to become someone very different. "Teach me how to use weapons," she said firmly. The next 3 days were the most intensive of Maria's life. Miguel and other resistance members taught her how to handle rifles, pistols, and hand grenades. She learned about military tactics, communication codes, and emergency procedures. Most importantly, she learned to think like a fighter rather than a healer. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was learning to destroy life after spending years learning to save it. But the resistance fighters help her understand that sometimes violence was necessary to protect innocent people from greater violence. "You're not becoming a killer," explained Elena, a former teacher who had joined the resistance after her husband was murdered by government forces. "You're becoming a protector. There's a difference." Maria proved to be a natural marksman, much to everyone's surprise. Her steady hands and calm nerves, developed through years of medical work, translated perfectly to weapons handling. She could hit targets accurately even under stress, and she learned tactical movement quickly. On the 4th day, Maria walked into the government military headquarters and volunteered her services as a medical examiner for the detention center. The commanding officer was suspicious, but also relieved to have a solution to his prisoner health problem. "Dr. Rodriguez vouches for your medical qualifications," he told her. "But you understand that you'll be working under military supervision. Any suspicious behavior will result in your immediate arrest." "I understand," Maria replied. "I just want to help ensure that the prisoners receive proper medical care." The detention center was even worse than she had imagined. More than 60 people were crammed into a building meant for storage, not human habitation. The conditions were deliberately harsh, designed to break the spirit of anyone who might support the resistance. Maria found her family in a corner of the main holding area. Her mother looked exhausted and frightened, but she was unhurt. Her brothers and sister were thinner than before, but appeared to be coping with the ordeal. When they saw her, their faces lit up with hope and relief. "I'm here as a medical examiner," Maria explained quietly while pretending to check her mother's blood pressure. "I'm going to get you out of here, but you need to be ready to move when I give the signal." Over the next 2 hours, Maria examined every prisoner while memorizing details about the building's layout and security arrangements. She counted guards, noted their positions and patrol patterns, and identified the best escape routes. She also provided real medical care to prisoners who were sick or injured, maintaining her cover while gathering crucial intelligence. That evening, she returned to the resistance camp with detailed information about the detention center. Commander Vasquez was impressed with her thoroughness and professionalism. "You're a natural at this," he told her. "Have you considered a career change?" Despite everything, Maria laughed. "I still prefer healing to fighting. But I'm learning that sometimes you have to fight to be able to heal." The rescue operation was planned for the following night. Maria would return to the detention center for another medical examination, but this time she would be armed and ready to fight. During her examination, she would unlock the main doors and disable the alarm system. Then, the resistance fighters would assault the building from multiple directions while she helped the prisoners escape. The plan required precise timing and flawless execution. If anything went wrong, everyone involved would likely be killed. As Maria cleaned her rifle and checked her ammunition the night before the rescue, she thought about how much her life had changed. Weeks earlier, she had been a simple ambulance driver whose biggest concern was arriving at emergencies on time. Now she was preparing for her first combat mission, ready to kill if necessary to protect the people she loved. Elena sat beside her in the cave, also preparing her weapons for the next day's operation. "Are you afraid?" she asked Maria. "Terrified," Maria replied honestly, "but more afraid of what will happen if we do nothing." "That's good," Elena said. "Fear keeps you alert and alive. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what needs to be done despite the fear." The next evening, as Maria walked back toward the detention center with a pistol hidden under her medical bag and a heart full of determination, she understood that her transformation was complete. The quiet ambulance driver had become a resistance fighter, ready to risk everything to save her family and her community. In a few hours, she would discover whether her newfound courage and skills were enough to succeed in the most important mission of her life. The battle for the detention center would test everything she had learned and prove whether the gentle healer could become an effective warrior. The war had made her into someone she had never expected to be. Now it was time to find out if that person could win. When it mattered most, the detention center looked different to Maria's eyes as she approached it for the second time. Where before she had seen a building holding prisoners, now she saw firing positions, escape routes, and tactical advantages. Her medical bag contained bandages and medicine, but also a loaded pistol and small explosive devices that could disable the alarm system. The guards recognized her from the previous day and waved her through the checkpoints without suspicion. Maria walked calmly toward the main building, but her heart was beating so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. In exactly 30 minutes, Commander Vasquez and his team would begin their assault. Everything depended on her ability to unlock the doors and create chaos inside the building. Inside the detention center, she began her fake medical examinations just as before. But this time, she was also memorizing final details about guard positions and preparing the prisoners for what was about to happen. When she reached her family, she spoke quietly while checking her mother's pulse. "In about 20 minutes, there's going to be fighting," she whispered. "When you hear the first gunshots, get everyone to lie flat on the floor and stay down until I come for you. Do you understand?" Her mother's eyes widened with understanding and fear. "Maria, what have you done?" "What I had to do," Maria replied softly. She moved through the building systematically, treating minor injuries and illnesses while positioning herself near the main control panel for the alarm system. The guards had grown comfortable with her presence and paid little attention to her movements. When her watch showed 5 minutes before the assault was scheduled to begin, Maria excused herself to use the bathroom. Instead, she slipped into a utility room where the main electrical controls were located. Her hands shook slightly as she attached the small explosives Miguel had given her to the alarm system and the electronic door locks. Everything was ready. In 3 minutes, she would trigger the explosives, unlock the doors, and the resistance fighters would storm the building. After that, there would be no turning back. She would be a combatant, not a medic. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance made her freeze. That wasn't part of the plan. Through a small window, she could see military helicopters approaching the detention center. Someone had betrayed them or the government forces had discovered the plan. Maria's mind raced through her options. She could abort the mission and try to escape, but that would leave her family and all the other prisoners in government hands. Or she could proceed with the plan despite the additional danger. Either choice could result in disaster. She made her decision in seconds. Pulling out her radio, she whispered urgently to Commander Vasquez. "There are helicopters incoming. Government reinforcements." "We see them," came the reply. "Proceeding anyway. Too late to stop now." Maria triggered the explosives, and the lights in the building flickered and went out. Emergency lighting came on, but the alarm system was dead and the electronic door locks had failed. Shouts of confusion came from the guards as they tried to understand what was happening. At that moment, the resistance assault began. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as Commander Vasquez's fighters attacked the building from 3 sides. The government guards, caught by surprise in a darkened building, struggled to organize an effective defense. Maria drew her pistol and moved toward the main holding area where the prisoners were kept. A guard appeared in the hallway ahead of her, reaching for his radio to call for help. Without hesitation, Maria shot him twice in the chest. The man fell, and Maria felt a mixture of horror and determination. She had just killed another human being for the first time in her life. There was no time to process the emotion. More guards were coming, and the prisoners needed to be evacuated before the government reinforcements arrived. Maria kicked open the door to the holding area and shouted to the prisoners, "Everyone stay down. We're here to get you out." The next few minutes were chaos. Resistance fighters poured into the building through the unlocked doors while government guards tried to mount a defense. Gunfire echoed through the concrete corridors, and smoke from explosions made it difficult to see. Maria fought her way through the confusion to reach her family. Her mother was protecting her younger children, pressing them against the floor as bullets flew overhead. "Stay with me," Maria shouted over the noise. "I'm going to get you out of here." She led her family toward an emergency exit that Commander Vasquez's team had secured. Other prisoners followed, moving in small groups under the protection of resistance fighters. The evacuation was working, but slowly, and the helicopter sounds were getting louder. As they reached the exit, Maria heard her name being called. Carlos, her former ambulance partner, was in the group of prisoners. He had been beaten badly and could barely walk. "Maria, help me," he pleaded. Despite everything that had happened between them, Maria couldn't abandon him. She helped him toward the exit while her brother Miguel supported him from the other side. Behind them, the fighting continued as resistance fighters held off the remaining guards. Outside the building, the scene was equally chaotic. Government helicopters were landing in the open areas around the detention center, disgorging fresh troops. Commander Vasquez's fighters had vehicles waiting to evacuate the prisoners, but they would have to fight their way through increasing numbers of enemy soldiers. "Get to the trucks," Commander Vasquez shouted as he provided covering fire with an assault rifle. "We can't hold this position much longer." Maria helped load her family into one of the vehicles, then turned back toward the building. There were still prisoners inside who needed help, and wounded resistance fighters who required medical attention. "Where are you going?" her mother called. "I'm a medic," Maria replied. "My job isn't finished." She ran back toward the detention center, now carrying her medical bag in one hand and her pistol in the other. The dual nature of her new role was becoming clear. She was both healer and warrior, saving lives and taking them as the situation required. Inside the building, she found 2 resistance fighters who had been wounded in the firefight. One had been shot in the leg. The other had taken shrapnel from a grenade. Working quickly under fire, Maria stopped the bleeding and got them stable enough to be moved. Commander Vasquez appeared beside her, bleeding from a head wound. "We have to go now," he said urgently. "They're bringing up heavy weapons." As if to emphasize his point, the building shook from an explosion. The government forces were using rocket-propelled grenades to blast holes in the walls. Soon, the entire structure would be uninhabitable. Maria and The commander carried the wounded fighters toward the exit, fighting their way through smoke and debris. Behind them, the last few resistance fighters were retreating, having completed the evacuation of prisoners. The mission was succeeding, but at a heavy cost. Outside, the convoy of rescue vehicles was already moving. Maria's family was safe in one of the trucks, along with most of the other freed prisoners. But several resistance fighters have been killed or wounded, and government reinforcements were arriving in large numbers. The escape route led through mountain roads that the resistance knew better than the government forces. But with helicopters providing aerial support, the enemy could track their movement and calling ground troops to set up roadblocks. Maria found herself in a vehicle with Commander Vasquez and several wounded fighters. As they raced through the mountains, she worked to treat injuries while bullets occasionally shattered the windows. This was combat medicine at its most challenging, trying to save lives while under direct attack. "There's a roadblock ahead," the driver called out. Military vehicles blocking the road. Commander Vasquez studied the situation through binoculars. "About 20 soldiers with machine guns. They got us trapped between the roadblock and the helicopters behind us." Maria looked at the wounded men she was treating, then at the vehicles ahead of them carrying her family and the other freed prisoners. They had come too far to be stopped now. "What if we don't go around the roadblock?" she suggested. "What if we go through it?" The commander looked at her with surprise. "That's extremely dangerous. We'd have to fight our way through." "Everything we've done today has been extremely dangerous," Maria replied. "But we've succeeded so far." The plan that emerged was desperate, but simple. The resistance fighters would concentrate their firepower on one section of the roadblock, while the vehicles carrying prisoners broke through the opening. It would be bloody, but it might work. Maria took her position alongside the other fighters, her rifle ready. The quiet ambulance driver, who had once saved lives through careful medical procedures, was about to participate in a frontal assault against trained soldiers. The transformation was complete. "Remember," Commander Vasquez said as they prepared to attack, "we're not fighting for politics or territory. We're fighting for the right to live in peace without fear." The assault began with coordinated rifle fire from the resistance fighters. The government soldiers at the roadblock were caught by surprise, expecting the convoy to try to turn around rather than attack. Several fell in the first exchange of gunfire. Maria found herself firing rapidly at targets she could barely see, trying to suppress the enemy's return fire. Her medical training helped her remain calm under stress, but this was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The noise was deafening, and the smell of gunpowder filled her nostrils. The vehicles carrying prisoners accelerated toward the gap in the roadblock. Government soldiers tried to stop them, but the concentrated fire from the resistance fighters made it impossible for them to aim effectively. One by one, the trucks and cars broke through the military position. Maria's vehicle was the last to escape. As they drove through the scattered remains of the roadblock, she saw several resistance fighters lying motionless on the ground. The victory had come at a terrible price, but they had won. The prisoners were free, including her family. The government's attempt to use civilian hostages as leverage had failed. Most importantly, the resistance had proven that the occupying forces could be defeated when people were willing to fight for their freedom. As the convoy disappeared into the mountains, Maria reflected on everything that had changed in her life. She was no longer the peaceful ambulance driver who had wanted nothing more than to help sick and injured people. The war had forced her to become someone harder and more dangerous. But as she looked at her freed family and the other liberated prisoners, she realized that her core mission hadn't changed at all. She was still saving lives. She had just learned new methods for doing it. The resistance would continue fighting until the government forces left their region. There would be more battles, more difficult decisions, and more transformations. Maria would play her part as both medic and fighter, healing the wounded and protecting the innocent. The gentle woman who had been underestimated by everyone had proven that courage comes in many forms. Sometimes it means rushing into danger to save lives. Sometimes it means picking up a rifle to protect the people you love. Sometimes it means refusing to remain neutral when neutrality enables evil. Maria Santos had learned all of these lessons. The war had taken away her peaceful life, but it had given her something else. The knowledge that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they were willing to sacrifice everything for what they believed in. In the mountains ahead, a new life awaited her. She would continue serving as a medic for the resistance, but she would also be a fighter when fighting was necessary. The ambulance driver had become a warrior, and she would never go back to being anything less than both.